Ronald Mason, a brother of my mother, Marjorie, uh, brother of also of Jimmy and Helen, and son of Florence and James Mason. And this is a continuation of the tape that we made some time ago, I guess 6 to 8 months ago. And that tape concluded with at the time of the death of Ronald's father. And so we're going to carry on roughly from there, and we're going to get a few more reminiscences.
After my father's death, on the 26th of August, 1923, things changed completely and utterly, although it took quite a while for us to really realize the depths of this. We had not been at Muskoka in our living memory, and actually after his death, my Aunt Mary Cooper, I believe, arranged for us to go to the Maple Leaf House, as it was called, a small hotel at Windermere, where we spent probably 2 or 3 rather unhappy days. This would be after Labor Day. The subsequent to my father's death, a matter of comparative few days, the headlines blared with the home bank failure, of which he had been the general manager. The horrendous effect of this was not even apparent at the start, and I'll digress for a few minutes to talk on that, because it affected everything subsequently. In the first place, all the money that we had in the bank was frozen. And over a period of a few years, we subsequently received 60 to 70% of that. But the damning thing about it was the shares of which we owned, our family owned, and numerous members of our family connection were in that time called double indemnity shares on bank stock, which meant the shares were not worth nothing, but you had to pay the par value of the shares into the liquidators. This, of course, made us in a state of bankruptcy, and pretty well many of our family members who also had bank stock. Now, not only was this, but the bank failing, at that time there was no such thing as deposit insurance. So the depositors, to say the least, were vehement in their outrage at such a thing happening to them. And it tarred our whole family with a rather ill fame. This did not sort of end with a sudden thing like that. It seemed to go on for considerable years, that somebody would rake the whole thing up and start again. And I can remember my mother saying, "Not again." This would be for many years later, reading some headline in the morning paper. The immediate changes in our family were not evident. My father died, as I said, at the end of August, and presumably our school fees had been paid for the following year, because Marjorie and Helen returned to Haverhill. Jimmy went back to Upper Canada College, and I started Upper Canada College at that time. But during the year, things began to change. The first thing that sticks in my mind of any note would be the departure of our Chinese cook or cooks, and subsequent employment of rather indifferent and cheaper maid, general cook type, some them were very nice, but we certainly were not living at the same scale as we did before. The cottage, of course, was sold or seized. The car disappeared, and we lived on at St. George Street for 2 more years. The second year we lived there, after my father's death, which would be in 1925, 26, I presume. Oh, excuse me, that would be incorrect, it'd be 24, 25. Marjorie and Helen were fortunate in still being able to go to Havergal. I don't know how they managed it. And Marjorie broke her leg some way at that time, and the people who lived across the road from us, the McMahons, had a chauffeur, and they very kindly arranged for the chauffeur to take Marjorie and Helen to school every day to Havergal, which was down on Jarvis Street at that time, and to pick them up in the afternoon. Apparently it was a bad break, because I can remember them doing this for must have been a couple of months. Jimmy and I stayed at Upper Canada College, also things were getting more meager. And finally, in the summer of 1925, we left St. George Street. The summer of 1923, correction, of 24, I can remember very well, because that year and the following year, I spent most of the summer at the carpenter's cottage. The carpenter was a great friend of mine, living down on St. George Street, Crothers Carpenter, and at their cottage near Bermorris in Muskoka. To digress for a moment, I saw the cottage a year or so ago. I hadn't seen it, very difficult to find. It was on the mainland. At that time you had to go to it by boat. But this was one of the last cottages in what they called the Millionaire's Row in Bermorris. And the cottage has certainly been improved greatly. I walked around it and everything, and I was quite interested to see the price. I checked on it, which was for sale, was $3,600,000. When I was there, it was not on that scale, but it was a very nice cottage. Marjorie and Helen, as I recall, but I'm not sure which summer it was, managed to get I think, an unpaid job as camp counselors at a camp on Lake Vernon, I believe, near Huntsville. I think they were real Joe girls there. They had to paddle every day to get the bread and milk about 3 miles, no matter what the weather was. And the living conditions were not good, but at least they got a summer of it. During the summer of 25, our house, which had been seized, was sold, and we had to get out. And when I came back from the summer at the Carpenters, we had moved to Gormley Avenue into a quadruplex. We were in the top side of one of the quadruplexes. The building is still there. It doesn't look that bad, but it was quite a change from our previous living. We lived there for approximately about 3 or 4 years. Marjorie and Helen had to go to work. And they started to work, I think, through the good offices of Mr. Patterson, who was the general manager of the Bank of Nova Scotia, was a friend of ours, in the, I believe, the Bank of Nova Scotia, in the filing or something in the vaults, which they didn't like, but more power to them. They managed to take secretarial courses at night, and finally, subsequently, some years later, both had quite good jobs. Jimmy, which was a great pity, as he was only, at the time, I guess, 15, nearly 16. I guess he turned 60. And, oh, he was only 50. He was 14, or just going on 15. He got a job as an office boy with F.B. Robinson Company, real estate, through the offices of a good friend of the family's, a Mr. McLaren. He worked at Robbins for approximately a year until he was 16 years of age, and he managed to get a job in the Toronto Dominion Bank, or at that time in the Dominion Bank, where he worked all the rest of his life. I was somewhat benumbed by the whole situation, I guess, in some ways. And I found myself going to the University of Toronto schools, as it was a lot cheaper. Now, I went there subsequently for 4 more years. And you might ask how the fees were paid. It was a combination of, my mother occasionally got an odd bit of money from some unusual source. I had some small amount of money in my bank account, which I had accumulated as a child, and the fees were very nominal. I think they were $15 a term, and there were 3 terms in the year. And possibly there were $20 in the senior school, but I went into the junior school. And I know one time when we were very desperate, Uncle Martin, who we'll mention later, paid 1 year for me. After living in Gormley, it wasn't such a bad place in some respects, but it was bitterly cold. And we didn't have proper heating at all in it. And my mother finally was forced to move because the rent, I believe, was about $40 a month. On top of that, we had to pay for the heat. So moved to Kendall Avenue, which subsequently became Tweedsmuir. This is that block of Kendall Avenue north of Sinclair Avenue, across from Catholic Church, whose name has just slipped my mind at this second.
The Rosary?
I'm not sure, Ted. I'm not sure. Maybe that's the name. Anyway, our